Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, From Formalism to Feminism, Gender, Business, and Human Rights. My name is Jen Malott from Cambridge University Press, and before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You've all joined in listen-only mode. However, you will have the opportunity to submit questions by typing into the Q&A box. You might send in your questions at any time during the discussion. They'll be addressed throughout the conversation if relevant and during the Q&A session at the end of today's event. If we're unable to get through all the questions during the session, additional comments can be included in the Q&A document that we will send with the recording later this week. If you experience any technical difficulties, please also add that to the Q&A box, and a member of the organizing team will endeavor to help you. And in the unlikely event that we experience any major technical issues, we'll message the audience and restart the webinar. The whole event will take about 1 hour. There'll be a few minutes at the end, again, for the questions in the Q&A. And to get everything started, I'm delighted to turn things over to the BHRJ editors, who will then introduce the panelists.
Yes, thank you, Jen, and welcome also from our side. Surya Deva and myself on behalf of all editors-in-chief of the Business and Human Rights Journal, and of course of the journal itself, of everybody involved in this endeavor. So we're welcoming you to this launch event or launch webinar of this special issue on gender, which has been published already. It's out, and you may have seen it. Hopefully you have seen it. You may have had the time and chance to read some of the exciting articles that we've published in this special issue. It is still open access for a while longer, I think through end of April, if I'm not mistaken. So if you haven't had the chance yet to read all of the articles, please do visit the website, and I think it will be sent to the website at the end of the webinar, and you can download the articles free access there for a while longer. So we would like to celebrate and really celebrate these special issues with a conversation with our guest editors of the special issue today. We have 60 minutes to just talk about the special issue itself, the challenges on the way to setting this special issue up, the hopes attached to it, and so on. And it really is a celebration, because I think this special issue really is also a milestone for our journal. It is the first full-fledged special issue that we've published, and you may remember that we have published special symposia or special issues before, but those were limited to either scholarly. We had a scholarly special issue, scholarly article special issue on security and human rights, and we had one with only developments in the field articles on agribusiness. And this one is the first one that really comprises of both scholarly articles and development in the field articles surrounding basically one subject or theme, which is the one on gender. So it is a milestone for the Business and Human Rights Journal as well, and therefore this webinar is really, I think, not just a launch, but also a celebration of this special issue. I would just briefly introduce our guest editors. And then I think, since we only have 60 minutes, we jump right into the conversation. You will also have the possibility, of course, to ask questions, also post comments through the Q&A function on your control panel. And we may take those questions right away if they relate to something that was said. So we might take them right there and then. But you can also, of course, post general comments or questions, and then we have, at the very end, we'll have some time to address those as well. So briefly, our guest editors, Nora Gutzman, she's a chief advisor. I'm not sure if I have to introduce them at all, actually, but I'm going to do it anyway. Chief advisor in human rights and business at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. Bonita Meersveld, associate professor of law at the School of Law at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. Then Johanna Burke-Martignoni is a senior research fellow at the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. And then last but certainly not least, Harpreet Kaur is a business and human rights specialist for UNDP's Business and Human Rights Engagement program. So with this said, I think I'm not going to prolong my welcoming words, and I hand it over to Surya for her first talking point.
Thank you, Florian, and hello, everyone. So let me start with the first question, and I'm curious, looking back, the guest editors, if you can share, why did you think that this special issue is relevant? Because that journey started pre-pandemic, right? And what, in your view, are the main contributions of this special issue to the BHR landscape? So if you can share some brief reflections, over to you.
So I'll jump in first, and I just wanted to quickly say, because I realize we don't have much time, that we're just really delighted that this special issue has seen the light of day, because it's been a long process, but a relatively joyful one despite the difficulties, and we've really enjoyed working on it and have also benefited from a lot of support from BHRJ that we'd also like to recognise. So one of the main motivations that we had for developing the special issue was very much a shared sense that current business and human rights frameworks are either gender blind or very binary and essentialist in the way in which they approach gender. And a lot of these inadequacies are also a reflection of international human rights law and the ways in which it often fails to confront and redress intersectional forms of discrimination, or to clearly analyze gender-based inequalities as being the product of specific power relations. And the end result of that is that we have legal and policy frameworks that use the term gender as a synonym for women, that treat women as a homogenous group, and then propose remedial mechanisms for business human rights harms as things that really fail to take into account both the diversity and the agency of all right holders. And so that's why we really felt that we wanted to promote feminist approaches to business and human rights and to international law, and to explore the potential there. And we felt that these feminist analytical frameworks and methods really require us to look at the structures of harm that business and human rights respond to, and to acknowledge that they're intersectional, that they're fluid, and that they're context specific. And we really wanted to bring home the message that gender is a relational construct. It's not just about women being inserted into existing unequal systems. And we need to look at the distribution of power and resources among people in order to understand how their rights and responsibilities are being exercised. So I'll hand off to Harpreet now, who's going to talk a little bit more about the way in which gender is perceived of in BHR frameworks.
Sure. Thanks, Joanna, and thanks, Surya, for that question. In fact, it takes me back to my first conversation with Nora in late 2018, when we started kind of really conceptualizing the special issue. So it's been really a long process for us. I was then leading, a Center for Women's Leadership at a university in India, and as part of my day-to-day work, I was meeting with lots of businesses. In fact, that was kind of my day-to-day job, and it was it was kind of really interesting to see how there was such a narrow understanding of what gender is, in particularly in the business and human rights space. That's you would remember that's around the time when you started, the UN Working Group started their project on gender. In 2018, we had the first consultation, the Asia consultation on gender, business, and human rights. And I think, to me, there was, also the kind of a trigger, because some of the issues that were identified, at these forums, at these regional consultations, we did realize there is, as Joanna also mentioned, like a range of issues, but across all the different meetings, different conversations that we were having with businesses, it was all about that it's a homogeneous group, not realizing that the structures of harm are multifaceted, intersectional, fluid, as well as context specific. And all we heard about these women empowerment projects, and it was kind of felt like, it's been considered as a human right, human resource issue, which was all about, bringing in the exact number of women, but not so much about equality and inclusivity. So there was diversity. The focus was really, bringing in gender diversity, again, with a very narrow definition of what gender is. but there was no inclusion in that space. And I think that kind of makes me, made me sort of felt like, this is something that we needed to kind of look more. And again, all the conversations are also around very specific thematic issues. So for example, the only issue that they would talk about, in fact, lots of businesses were about Women's Day, what they do on Women's Day, International Women's Day, but, also briefly a very few on sexual harassment at workplace. So the conversation was really moving in between there, but, all of this was just about at the very, very superficial level. And I think all of this kind of demonstrated that gender isn't, was considered as an add-on to corporate accountability and the narrow understanding of gender and gendered impacts. I think the lastly is, personally, I saw very, very few perspectives from the global South, and particularly from academics in Asia. There's very little scholarship on the subject, and it felt like, this is something that there is a gap, and that gap needs to be filled. And I think for me, that was a trigger to kind of get engaged in the process. And thanks to Nora for bringing up with that idea, actually. Nora, you want to add further, maybe?
Sure,
Probably
thanks,
the
Harpreet.
contribution. What contributions, in your view, Nora, this special issue makes?
Yeah, I think the special issue makes a couple of key contributions. One issue that we are all, I think, also pretty passionate about is that it maybe tries to break down what we would see as this false dichotomy between kind of theory and practice. So sometimes there seems to be an idea that on the one side, there's, academics, and they're sitting in the ivory tower of academia and have, the academic authority to kind of write scholarly papers. And then on the other hand, there's practitioners, and they're busy out there, in the real world implementing projects. Without very much sort of linkage between those two. And we would say that particularly from a feminist perspective, and when we're talking about gender and business and human rights, it's really important to question sort of some of those ideas and to try to maybe break those down a little bit, to also see that actually there are a lot of feminist scholars or academics working on the themes of gender and business and human rights that would call themselves, activists, and that actually have specific objectives for their academic work to also contribute to changes. And likewise, there are many practitioners that perhaps don't only want to be included in the academic space as objects of study, but rather also have opinions that they can articulate in a, if you like, scholarly kind of forum and way. And that's one of the things that we really tried to kind of break down a little bit with the contributions in the special issue. So cutting across both the scholarly papers and also the developments in the field. So that's one of the other themes, I think, that we wanted to highlight, that we really wanted to kind of stress in the issue. Maybe two other things to mention. One is that we were also really aiming to bring an interdisciplinary perspective to some of these issues. And I would say we've done that with moderate success, because it was really not without its challenges, because the field of business and human rights is still very much dominated by legal scholars and sort of legal perspectives. But we have done our best to at least sort of start to sort of bring in some other disciplines and to look at these things from an interdisciplinary perspective. And then we did also try to maybe include some issues that traditionally are maybe not considered to be business and human rights issues per se. So there's several contributions in the special issue that might be more traditionally associated with other disciplines. So there's some of the things that I could add.
Thank you. I think this also raises a point about process, right? Especially if you talk about practice theory divide or trying to bring them closer together, break down the barriers between them. Then nevertheless, I think with a special issue like this one, you're still operating within a given structure and as such within given constraints, right? And that shows, I think, that if you choose a theme like, well, even business and human rights, but maybe gender specifically, I mean, you cannot separate, I think, the theme and topic that you choose from the process that you follow in terms of how you gonna set up and create that special issue. Nevertheless, I think the more you do so, the more you run against also challenges given by existing scholarly conventions and existing structures and so on. It's also a negotiation process, I guess, between editors-in-chief and guest editors, between guest editors and authors, and so on, right? So can you maybe talk a little bit more about the process that you use to really kind of develop that special issue and the challenges you ran into with particularly this kind of focus on gender and trying to also follow a gender sensitive approach, perhaps, in setting it up?
Sure. Thanks, Florian. If I could start, and I'll invite other guest editors to join. I think to begin with, the approaches we used in developing these issues are in some ways a true reflection of all of our ideologies and our approaches, but I think our own experiences that perhaps each one of us have had. Not just, and I think this particularly is also relevant for what was happening during COVID as well. I think to begin with, again, we adopted a feminist approach to the special issue, not just for the substance or not just for looking at the substance, but also ensuring that the editorial process that we have is really rooted in feminist praxis as well as practice. Yeah. So I think in the way that we were looking at, at the again onset of our discussions, we were very confident that we really wanted to bring together and include voices from early career researchers, as much as, of course, we wanted to bring in the voices from established scholars and practitioners. And I think that was something that we really have, in some ways, gone all and out about to sort of, include that process, because that also meant that, creating an environment where they are, where they are able to include and, contribute as well. So, for example, we held several workshops. With the authors to develop more of a communal, conversational approach to generating and elaborating ideas. And I think the advantage of bringing in these new researchers and early career researchers with the established scholars and practitioners was also in terms of ways how we ended up establishing a community of practice where, we also had like these mentors who would then be able to sort of also guide these, some of these early career people through the process. I think when we received sort of about 55 abstracts following the original call for papers, I think 21 developed into scholarly pieces or development in field pieces. And as I said, and that Nora sort of highlighted how we were looking at also the disciplinary approaches and then bringing in that sort of a disciplinary diversity in the special issue. And I think that's something that really did require a lot of effort. And we wanted to make sure that we bring in ideas, not just from a legal perspective, but also bringing in other perspectives as well. Honestly, in the end, we, of course, were not able to include some of actually really exciting and innovative papers for various reasons. A lot of different issues and thematic issues emerged, and the conversation and connections were made instead of consolidating this broader community of practice on gender, business, and human rights. But I think what it really has helped us is bringing together these using the feminist approach. I think provided us sort of an enabling environment to bring in the diversity of voices as well.
Thank you. Maybe as a follow-up question, I mean, this special issue, and this, it was a long way coming in a sense, right? There's lots of work involved with it. It's a lengthy process, and now this process fell, to a good part exactly into the time with COVID and things being shut down and major challenges appearing also, and perhaps particularly for the audience that you target with your special issue. Can you say maybe a few more words about maybe some of the challenges that arise for you through this specific situation?
Sure. I mean, in fact, all of us have had challenges, and in both in our personal spaces as well during COVID. And I think that's something that even our authors, sort of suffered. And I think this whole conversation was about the additional care work and the responsibilities, or how gendered impacts of COVID also. I think we saw all of that really first-handed, not just within our experience with our own personal experiences, but also with the authors who were contributing. I think, in fact, in the end, there were some authors who had to withdraw because there were additional, some of the processes were delayed or the papers were delayed because the authors, and I think most of these authors, in fact, all the authors are women, and how they were to sort of then take on additional responsibilities, particularly in context of the care work, and how that delayed the processes in some ways, but also the additional burden, that kind of came up in terms of teaching and contributing to your professional space while you're still writing. So, how much time were women really able to put aside to writing? And I think there's data that says that, publishing by women during COVID has come down, whereas by men it has increased during that period. And I think that's something we saw because, women dropped out of the process midway because they were just not had any time to, to kind of complete the papers. I think we did push it to a certain extent, and that required, also from us, it required a lot of additional support as editors to also do a bit of more hand-holding. And I think in the end, we did a lot more hand-holding perhaps, or, we were there to provide support. And I think that kind of really helped in bringing the special issue together. But just also, I have had really a horrible time, especially during the second phase of COVID. And, I saw the kind of support that was provided, that was kind of extended by all the guest editors. And I think that kind of speaks to about the differential impacts that we have had. But the value of support and having that network around to support, I think really, really impacted special issue as well. I don't know if anybody else among the guest editors wants to add.
I don't see anyone else jumping in for now, but feel free to do so. So I'm also curious because one theme that is a cross-cutting issue that all of you highlighted, and hopefully Bonnie will also agree with that, is that there is no homogeneity when it comes to rights holders or women and all that. So how did you bring in this issue of diversity and inclusion into your process? What challenges did you experience? And how did you overcome those challenges? If you can share some insights, because this was, of course, one special issue, but perhaps others can learn some lessons from this process, and there'll be more special issues of other journals, and how we can learn some lessons, important lessons to mainstream those particular aspects. I don't know who would like to start.
So I'm happy to jump in here, and because I haven't yet had an opportunity to thank Surya and Florian for their support through this, let me do so now. And also thank you to my wonderful co-editors. It's been fantastic, and I think that feeds into a little bit of the answer to the question you've raised, Surya. The whole process and content of the special edition in many ways is revolutionary and systemic. So we've discussed a little bit about the way in which the editorial process happened. But what I really want to emphasize is that this is not thematic as such. And the approach and content of this journal is really about foundational restructuring of the way in which we work, and the way in which we conceptualize business, human rights, and those who are affected by them. And that applied equally to the way in which we would engage with, target, access, and benefit from different authors. And typically, I think we've all heard the refrain of, yes, but there are no authors from the Global South, or yes, but there are no experts from particular regions. And actually they are, but there are a host of factors that, and barriers that preclude those voices from participating in this international dialogue and narrative. A lot of it is financial, not being able to meet at the palaces of Geneva, but rather, to really be able to contribute meaningfully from wherever in the world a person is located. So it meant doing something that went beyond just the call for papers. It meant seeking out people who both were junior in their careers, but also who perhaps were not participating in the mainstream business and human rights debates, but were in fact writing on that literature and writing on those issues. And that was an extraordinarily wonderful journey, because it was not only a case of us finding people, but also people finding that they actually had a lot of information and insight to provide that ordinarily hadn't been requested of them. So that was a particularly important step for all of us to take. And we just were not going to publish a special issue that did not represent people from around the world. It wasn't going to happen.
So I think, Bonnie, your point about that if we merely issue an open call and rely on that, that may not be sufficient, because that looks like, if I reinterpret your observation, like formal equality. But substantive equality will demand guest editors to go out everywhere in the market space and find out those authors which are there, who may not be able to respond to this open call for various reasons, right? That's something that you highlighted for all of us as an important lesson in my view. But I also want to pick one word that you used, junior scholars. Should we also not question this hierarchy and call certain scholars as junior and others as senior? What do you think about that?
I think I'm always terribly eager to be adventurous with our terminology, and all existing terminology carries with the pre-existing kind of stereotypes. And you're quite correct, because a person may be 2 or 3 years old in their career, but have published far more profound work and insightful work than people who have been academics or practitioners for far longer. And I think that's a really important point to make. It's about removing assumptions about capability, removing assumptions about skill and insight. And that has been a blossoming and a most wonderful alternative, which applies not only to the content of the journal, not only to the process of the journal, but I think to so many aspects of law and life.
Great.
Yeah, and if I could just quickly jump in there, I think, Bonnie, you raised some excellent points. And I think also part of our process, if we do really want to follow through with a feminist method, is also to recognize that a lot of the ideas that we have about expertise and who is qualified to comment and what knowledge is valued come from the very same structures that tend to reinforce inequalities. And so if we really want to kind of throw things open and say that we want to change systems that establish these hierarchies, then I think we need to follow through in our own academic practice and recognize that, you know, we could have a doctoral degree, but maybe we don't know as much as someone who is speaking from the standpoint of having experienced a harm from a business. And so we really wanted to also reflect that.
Thank you. Maybe you can stick with content for a while longer. I'm glad, Bonnie, that you mentioned kind of the theme foundation discrepancy before. You know, that gender is not a theme, because I know that I called it kind of the thematic focus of the special issue. But I'm glad you actually corrected this. You know, we're talking really about the foundation, or a foundational part of the business and human rights field, because otherwise I think we get into this, Harpreet called it add-on, right? So that we see gender just as an add-on to corporate accountability, or just as one particular discussion within the business and human rights field. But that's certainly not the point of this special issue, right? The point of the special issue is to show that this is a foundational question that we're addressing here. Now, you in your excellent editorial, you try to kind of frame the special issue along kind of three, or a structure along three broad topics. Could you maybe address those briefly and talk a little bit more about those, also addressing some of the articles that have been published within the special issue? I'm not sure who wants to take this one, but I think it would be good to talk about those themes a little more. Now I said themes again.
Well, I think we also thought that in the editorial, we really wanted to try to draw together some of the common points that emerged, but obviously we chose a way of structuring the editorial to reflect what we pulled out of the different articles, but there were some overlapping ideas. I don't want to say the word themes, but certainly one of them, and I'll speak to the one about embodiment, which really to us speaks about the way in which bodies and constructs of gender and sex-based attributes are commodified by business, and draws attention to the need for greater state regulation and human rights due diligence in several sectors that perhaps aren't traditionally covered by the business and human rights framework. So we had the papers on the female sexual and reproductive wellness industry, which is, you know, this incredibly lucrative but very unregulated market. And a lot of that is underpinned by the failure of governments to provide accessible and good quality reproductive and sexual healthcare and education, but trading on constructs about how women should experience various forms of sexuality and this very embodied, you know, biological processes. There was also a paper on for-profit commercial surrogacy providers that have been regulated, but the not-for-profit surrogacy organizations that facilitate these processes have not been the subject of business and human rights analysis. And so that was an interesting take on that very embodied, you know, way in which we can commodify a reproductive function there. And then there was also a piece that looked at the way in which marketing and advertising plays on toxic masculinities, constructing harmful tropes about girls' sexuality in order to promote different products that are targeted at children through their marketing. But beyond the sort of construction of femininities, masculinities through business practices and the harms that they also enact on different people. One of the very key insights that emerged from this theme of embodiment was also the fact that the typical narrative of business and human rights of women as helpless victims of corporate human rights abuses is quite limiting, because it fails to recognize and support the agency that a lot of feminist movements are already exercising. So we also included in this theme of embodiment, the Columbia paper that looked at Indigenous women who are defending their human rights, the human rights of their communities against mega projects, and using processes of resistance that they have been able to overcome some of the silencing practices that have been directed at them because they inhabit the bodies of Indigenous women, and they're trying to overcome traditional social norms. So I hand over for the second theme to, I think it was Bonnie.
Thanks very much. So the second theme really was about positionality in the marketplace. And by this, our objective, which really grew out of the content of the various pieces, but the objective was to show that it's not a question of women needing to be empowered, to be given some kind of additional support in order for women to become equal participants in and beneficiaries of the marketplace, but rather that the marketplace has been structured for so long along the lines of race and gender that privilege men and white, that it becomes a fiction to say, well, let's take a step-by-step or case-by-case empowerment process. I remember supervising a doctoral study at Zimbabwe University, the Women's Law Center, where one of the researchers spoke about how in interviewing women, they had said to her, you know, we don't want your basket weaving initiatives. We just want the utensils that are actually ours to be able to till our own fields and to grow our own food so that we can participate in the marketplace of production. So so this notion of empowerment, I think, was addressed in several of the articles, especially around the public-private dyad and understanding that when you are operating in a private and public marketplace of production and reproduction, you are obviously undertaking a dual operation, being paid for one of them and for one of them only being paid less. So the discussion about the human rights and gender-informed understanding of the SDGs, for example, was included analysis of the structural factors that recreate inequality, particularly in the fashion sector, which is linked obviously to supply chains, which we know are deeply gendered. And the reasons why they're deeply gendered is not because women are incapable of running the companies that are responsible for fashion, but rather because women are in the most indigent circumstances, poverty is highly feminized, and therefore will take on work that is the least paid and the most insecure. And in fact, part of this theme argues that it's not only a failure to remove barriers that facilitate women's meaningful participation in and beneficiation from the marketplace, but in fact, it's necessary for the exploitation of impoverished women to continue. Profit is made precisely because there is low paid labor produced by women. And that labor is, women are paid less, not because of the work that they do, with being less valuable, but because of who they are. And that is very much an inheritance of a colonial structure, which is pointed out again in some of the pieces in this sort of thematic area, particularly around the nature of the company and the corporation itself. The assumption that these are neutral and organic and unchanging or inevitable structures is in fact incorrect. These were structures that were created by people with power to advance people with power, to benefit people with power. And it's those assumptions of stagnation and structural kind of consistency that actually we're trying to upend.
Nora, I don't know if you want to touch upon the third theme, because there was a third theme as well. And I'm also curious if you want to add a little bit on that. Did you think of these three themes when you were designing the special issue, or it just happened that these themes came up while you were editing these papers and curating these papers? So if you can share some reflections on that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, happy to. Yeah, I mean, the third sort of theme that stretches throughout the contributions we ended up calling borderlessness, and that really has two key dimensions to it. The first one is around the questions of accountability in global business models, essentially. So when we're thinking about new technologies or global supply chains or value chains, you know, this idea of national territories being able to regulate these, we know, of course, already through business and human rights is a fiction. So that was sort of one of the key elements that we looked at there in relation to some of those business models, how they're structured, and also some specific kind of themes or industry sectors. But then a second component that emerged that we also found very interesting was around the ways in which business and human rights norms come about and how they are utilized and implemented. So this dimension between, you know, business and human rights norms that might be created at a sort of global level, and then how are they, you know, used or applied at the national level, or vice versa, you know, how are certain norms generated in a particular context, and then how do they become sort of something that's also used in global frameworks or other national context for that matter. So we looked in the contributions sort of at some of those themes as well. And in terms of how, whether we had thought about these themes beforehand, I would say maybe it's a little bit of yes and no. I mean, I think in some of the initial brainstorming, when we first got together sort of as an editorial group and came out with the call for papers, and then we're reviewing the abstracts and sort of making the selections, we did talk in a lot of detail about what are we trying to do here, and why would we select, one abstract over another, and what are we trying to look at? So I would say, even in those early conversations, some of these themes had already come up, and we did think about them and recognize that there could be a lot of benefit for the business and human rights community, and indeed the wider community, to sort of think about some of those themes. But then in terms of, structuring the editorial along particularly these 3 lines, I think that then really emerged once we had all the papers together. And as Joe also mentioned at the start, I mean, it is, an order. We had to somehow order and structure the editorial. So it was also an aid for us to be able to introduce the papers in a way that drew on some of the kind of key things that emerge from the papers as a whole. But on the other hand, of course, it does also remain a little bit artificial in the sense that many of the papers speak to all 3 dynamics. So I think a little bit of a mix. Yeah.
Okay. So what you're suggesting is that you created a structure in the editorial which challenged the patriarchal structures, right? So you creating a new structure to fight another structure of power, right? We got a very important but complex question in the Q&A, and if you have not had a chance to look at it, the question is about something we have grappled and we discussed it. Guest editors and editor-in-chief is about access to what we publish in any journal, a top journal like Business and Human Rights Journal, and we take pride in that. And I think we try our best to ensure access by taking a number of tools, but I think the challenge remains. So how do we deal with this? And Bonnie, you were talking about the market, right? So how do we grapple with this challenge where scholars may not be willing to publish because they think, oh, I would like to publish in a journal which is open access. But there is this perception, at least, that the open access journals are not great. They're not great for promotions, right? So if you're publishing in open access journals, and I think that also goes back to the earlier point Nora was making, the distinction between practitioners and scholars. So scholars publish in peer-reviewed journals, and many of which may not be open access, and practitioners may publish in open access journals. So how do we, ultimately someone has to pay for these journals, right? So from where the funding comes. So I think these are the complex questions, but I think if you want to reflect on that, anyone, that would be useful. And I would also like to invite the audience, if you have any further questions, please raise those questions. We only have about 10 or so minutes left. But I'm also curious about, it was merely one special issue, guest editors, right? You could not have covered everything. You mentioned about 55 or so abstracts, and I think that was a very big number. I think one of the largest we ever received, so that was great. But you could not cover and you could not select everything. We had the limit of page numbers. So what is missing? If you have to, let us say, guest edit another journal issue on gender, business, and human rights, what are the themes that you would like to include? Anyone, and if you can be brief, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to come in on the themes question. Indeed, we would have loved to include a lot more themes, but we really see this as only the start of a conversation, I think, is perhaps the underlying point there. I mean, some of the things that really jump out at us in terms of things that would be good to cover going forward are things such as the nexus between environment, climate, and migration. I think the sort of something on environment and climate really is a key sort of gap. But then there's also other points that could be covered. For example, contributions from the MENA region, technology, AI, artificial intelligence. We didn't manage to cover that. Of course, something explicit about how COVID-19 interacts with existing care work dynamics, as Harpreet had mentioned, could be a point for further attention. Privatization, particularly of essential services and the role of businesses in that, could be a key theme. The gig economy and rural populations, or urbanization. I mean, we could go on, but to keep it brief, they were probably some of the things that were most obvious to us in terms of gaps.
So you're basically asking us to have a second bite at the cherry, right?
Absolutely. Isn't that a very neat 10 articles, Surya? Right there.
All right.
But if I may just say, it actually speaks to what we, in a way, hope is that every contribution to this topic, to business and human rights, should actually be cognizant of the diversity of experiences of people who are hurt by business and business operations. So all of those topics should always be approached through or understanding that it's a matrix that doesn't only have one homogeneous victim survivor, that doesn't only have one homogeneous approach. So absolutely another special issue, go for it, happily. But also, this I think is the challenge, right? Everybody, men and women, specialists or non-specialists, working in this area, and I should not, non-gender conforming people, everybody should be writing on this from a perspective that is about inclusivity and reflection.
Thank you. We're almost already in the maybe concluding question in a sense about next step. But I briefly wanted to go back to the question that was asked in the chat, or the comment that was made, because I do think there's also a specific kind of gendered aspect to that, right? I mean, the whole publication model and also the business models of publishing houses. I think there is a gendered aspect to it, in the sense that, and that's been mentioned in the chat, that all the work that is being done is basically unpaid work. And as such, it's also a privilege, I think, to be able to contribute to a special issue, whether as an editor or as somebody who publishes research. Because I mean, all of us, if we think of when we do our research, it's most often not during our daytime when, the kids are occupied at school or whatever, but it's very often in those kind of times when the kids might be home. And so if you do that research work, it almost presupposes that there is someone else who takes care of the rest to kind of, free up that space. And it also presupposes that you can afford, using your time in a way that is not paid, right? And it competes with other non-paid work. One is a privilege, and the other one is maybe sometimes more of a burden. And the distribution between those two kinds of works is fairly clear. So I just wonder if somebody wanted to react to those, also in terms of, just kind of the decision of putting out a special issue on this topic, whether there was some sort of a dilemma that you are, in a sense, buying into a structure that runs counter to what you're actually trying to stand for with the special issue.
Oh, definitely, Florian. I think that, and I also think that the question in the chat raises broader questions, not only about practitioners engaging in unpaid labor for something that might not necessarily have any direct professional benefit to them, but even, we have also had long chats about the neoliberal university and the fact that many academics can't actually publish these days because you're not paid to publish necessarily. And so there is that structure that reposes on a system of people who do unpaid peer review, who do unpaid writing, and then have to pay to read articles. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that this is a big structural question. We hope that by potentially addressing some of these ideas about labor and how it's valued, and how we could potentially reimagine different ways of doing things, maybe we can chip away at some of those ideas, but I don't think it's going to happen. No matter how fabulous this issue is, I don't think we can get there here. But yes, they certainly were questions that came up through the process.
Thank you. And then maybe, oh yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I can just see that the person who asked that question has rephrased it in a certain way. And I think the only answer is that you're correct. It's an incredibly unfair system. I think there's a revolution happening in open access. I think that we'll see that over a period of time, possibly not soon, but in due course, that there is going to be, it's going to be very difficult to maintain a completely closed access positionality in publishing. But then also, I think it's up to us to really value work for what it is and to publish. There's no reason with the technological world in which we live why publishing can't just be done independently. Of course, it comes up against a whole bunch of issues around peer review and so on. But I do think that we're on that trajectory. But yeah, you're right, and it's unfair.
Thank you. And also thank you for this contribution, Julia, from the audience. I think it's an important question to address, especially shortly before Jen of CUP will come on here again, right? Which is a little hint there. But before we have a few minutes left, not very much, but I did want to briefly maybe give you an opportunity to just outline or mention some of the planned next steps that will follow. I mean, this is this special issue. It has been a long process, and now it's published. But it's not the end of the story, right? In many regards, it may just be kind of the beginning of a further going process and other initiatives to follow suit. So maybe you can just briefly mention some of those.
Yeah, happy just to mention a couple of the things that we have in the pipeline already. One is that we have also published just a very short blog to outline, what the special issue is about for those that need an even more synthesized version than the editorial. And following this, I guess, more general introduction to the special issue, we would hope throughout this year to host a couple of seminars, hopefully even in person or hybrid format, but we might also do a few more online events where we can also draw in some of the authors and either discuss some of the themes with the authors, perhaps also some guest speakers, etc. So we would definitely hope to have 2 or 3 additional seminars or webinars to sort of engage people in this conversation as we progress it. And then the special issue, speaking of open access, which doesn't solve the structural issue, but just very practically, as has been mentioned, it is open access at the moment for a few more weeks. And actually a lot of the scholarly articles will be open access on a permanent basis. And then there will be another period throughout the year, which we still need to set a date for, but where it will be available open access again as a special issue. And then one thing which was mentioned by Harpreet, so this is, I guess, more a call out also to the audience, is that we would love it if people would get in touch with us with any suggestions that they have on how to further build this community around gender and business and human rights. Is that about having more conversations? Do we need to meet in person? Do we need to have collaborative processes on some of these themes? I think those initial sort of workshops that Harpreet mentioned that we had with the authors were really interesting, also just from the perspective of having a space to sort of have some of these conversations. So this is just also an invitation to anyone who's participating today or who might engage with this webinar afterwards in the recorded format. Very happy to hear from you with ideas of how we can further the conversation together as a community.
And if I could just add, also, we organize, as part of the work that I'm doing at UNDP, we've been organizing in collaboration with Surya, and Bonita has also spoken at some of the sessions, but we organize what's known as the Asia Scholars Workshop. And I know that Surya has much larger, teaching business and human rights network, and gender, business and human rights is going to be one of the key themes for the upcoming workshops, hopefully in the second quarter. So we would send out a call for, call for people who want to participate. So yeah, just, stay tuned and sort of check out the space. We would have more opportunities to bring up these conversations, but also to join the networks that are already established and further take forward from there.
So basically what you're telling is that this was merely the end of a beginning. So this special issue is not everything. More work needs to be done. We, of course, can explore more special issues, if not as part of BHRJ, or who knows, we can revisit after 5 years. What have we achieved and where we need to go? And of course, there was another interesting idea about the business model of publishing. So potentially a special issue on that. So plenty of food for thought. I guess we are almost close to our time of 1 hour. So we should, Florian, try to wrap it up, I believe. So I guess we should thank all the guest editors. It has been a pleasure for the journal and two of us to work closely with you. So thank you very much for selecting BHRJ to publish this special issue. We very much enjoyed working with you all, and I hope you and the authors had a good experience of working with us and the Cambridge University Press. And we look forward to our collaboration in different forms. We would also like to thank all the participants who joined virtually. And with this, I would like to pass it back to Jen.
Thank you, everyone, for joining today. A short survey will pop up momentarily if you have any other questions you'd like to submit that we can share with the panelists after the fact. We will also be sending around the recording within the next week or so. And the BHRJ special issue on gender can be found on the journal's website, which you can find at cambridge.org/BHRJ. And as Florian mentioned earlier, the special issue is currently free to access and will be for a period of time. So all that's left is many thanks and have a great rest of the week. Thank you all.